truth, justice, or the American way. When I opened the show, I said that every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. That's Eric Hoffer's line. I don't entirely agree, but I do think that the origin and arguable degeneration of the right-wing movement, of the conservative movement, of the free market, or just, let's say, the market fundamentalist movement, is an interesting and important topic, and one that gets vastly too little attention. When you think about it, these folks have now risen to such prominence, they control much of the country, control much of the world, and how many people can actually name the philosophical underpinnings, the leaders of right-wing history, and really understand and connect those dots? Whether one is an activist or a partisan or merely just a historian, this stuff is really important and really interesting. I want to bring on now our guest, Seth Cotlar, professor of history, going to talk to us about it, has been doing a bunch of research on the history of the conservative movement. Seth, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Should I call you Doctor or Seth? Mr. Cutler, the Honorable? How would you like to be referred?
His Excellency would be great. No,
all right.
Just Seth is fine.
So, Seth, explain your area of research and how you got into this mess.
So I'm trained as a historian of 18th and 19th century America. My first book was on actually radicalism in the late 18th century. It was about Tom Paine and the Americans who loved him in the era of the French Revolution. But then that got me interested in conservatism because the 1790s is also the birth of what we think of as modern conservatism, with the writings of Edmund Burke writing against the French Revolution. And so out of that, I started getting interested in conservatism, and I'm teaching at a liberal arts college in Oregon with largely progressive students. And around the time of the Tea Party in 2010, I started to get kind of dismayed by the way my students understood what conservatism was, that they tended to think of it as a deficit, as ignorance. And even though I myself don't identify as a conservative, I was like, I thought, this isn't really very useful for you to just think of conservatism and equate it with ignorance. You should understand this political tradition before you reject it, or if you want to actually work against it in any meaningful way. So I started teaching a course on the history of American conservatism starting in 2010. And I've been doing it every year, every other year since then. So needless to say, things have evolved a bit in terms of how historians think about the history of conservatism since, the second year of Barack Obama's presidency.
And how do you think the understanding, the definition of conservatism has changed in the minds of most Americans?
So I think that's a long story.
No, I know. We're not going to be able to do the whole course in the next few minutes, but please just talk very, very fast and write your entire course on a couple grains of rice.
Exactly. So basically, in 2016, when I was teaching the course, a lot of what we were reading and the way the students were responding to what we were reading was, well, gosh, what Donald Trump is saying, he doesn't sound like a conservative in any really meaningful way. He doesn't seem to embrace these things. He surely doesn't sound like Edmund Burke. He surely doesn't sound like a free market fundamentalist with all of his talk of tariffs and so on and so forth. And many folks in the class, and we were reading, for example, the National Review, which put out an entire edition devoted to the idea that Donald Trump is not a conservative. Mm-hmm. But then he won. And now when you look at the polls, and people who identify themselves as conservative overwhelmingly support Donald Trump and admire Donald Trump.
And there's so much to untangle. There's so much to untangle because part of what I would say that when David Frum and others were saying this dude isn't a conservative was part because what he was saying about trade, what he was saying about Social Security, Medicare, what he was saying about campaign finance reform, and he was just lying. Like he didn't do it, with the exception of trade, like the stuff that fell most squarely out of the conservative tradition, he just didn't do. He just said in order to try to get working class votes in Pennsylvania.
Exactly. Yeah, and so he's governed basically like a standard Republican, tax cuts and deregulation. So there really hasn't been anything discernible that he's actually done as a policymaker that is, other than perhaps his like extreme saber rattling around immigration. That there was mixed feelings amongst Republicans in the 2000s and aughts about immigration reform, and there's a long history of that. So he's more extreme on the immigration issue than standard issue Republicans would have been in the 2000 aughts or early 2010s. But aside from that, he's basically governed in the way that one would expect Mitt Romney to govern, or in terms of the actual policies, which is why Ben Sasse and Jeff Flake and Susan Collins, regardless of all of their statements of disappointment, if you look at their voting record, they vote 95% with Donald Trump.
Yep.
So that it's that discrepancy between his sort of authoritarian persona and the kind of cult of personality that he has very consciously cultivated, and the extreme attacks on the press, the extreme attacks on the basic norms and values of law and order and political procedures that really make him distinct from what we would think of as like a John McCain or a Mitt Romney. But this is where he invokes, to a historian like me, other historical precedents like Father Coughlin from the 1930s, a demagogic radio preacher who was a fascist and kind of sympathetic to the Nazis, but also a populist. Donald Trump also invokes Pat Buchanan. If you think about the 1992 speech that Pat Buchanan gave at the GOP convention, I remember at the time, I was like in my early 20s, and my favorite line about that was by Molly Ivins, the political journalist from Texas, who said, apparently the speech was much better in the original German.
I remember. And I've even heard it argued that the victory of Donald Trump over the younger Bush was like the youngest Bush of that generation, at least, was a bit akin to Buchanan having beaten the elder Bush.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I think in the 90s, for many folks, they saw Buchanan as a dinosaur, that he was just this weird leftover from the past that kind of lived inside the Republican Party as this kind of dying vestigial thread. And it turns out that Pat Buchanan was actually the future of the party. Right? It took a while.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And let me ask this, because they're about to cut us off.
Okay.
There is a debate that has raged. It hasn't raged enough, actually, but it is out there, whether Donald Trump is a departure from the conservative tradition, or in fact it's apotheosis, or in fact it's sort of at furthest away, it's Frankenstein's monster. How would you characterize it? Do you consider Trump an outgrowth of the conservative movement, or in some important way a departure?
Yes, I think he is an outgrowth of that movement. So that movement was always very complicated and fractured, right? So I think whenever Trump conservatives say that they revile him and don't see him as one of their own, I think they're speaking in good faith when they say that.
We're back with Seth Cotlar, who teaches a course on the history of the conservative movement. Seth, let me ask this. What would surprise people the most, you think, or what would surprise the most people, at least a little bit, when it comes to the history and genesis and evolution of the conservative movement? Or if that's too hard a question, what do you think is most important for people to know? If somebody said, listen, Doc, I'm not sticking around to take the course, I just wanted your best sentence, what would that be? What's the most important thing people need to know?
So I think an important thing that people need to know is the way in which theoretically kind of gender and racialized neutral language of freedom has been used as a kind of dog whistle to justify various conservative positions. Let me make that more clear. So there's a great book called White Flight about Atlanta in the 1960s. And part of his argument is that when a whole bunch of white people fled Atlanta to flee desegregating schools, to flee integrating workplaces, they did so in the name of freedom. They were like, I want to live in a community with people like me, and I don't want to pay all these taxes. I want to live a life of freedom. None of that is about racism. But what was driving them out was black people moving into their neighborhoods, black people coming into their schools, black people swimming in their public pools. So white people in 1940s and 50s Atlanta loved public pools. They went to them all the time. Nobody had a private pool. And then in the 1960s, suddenly people discovered the joys of having a pool in your own backyard in the suburbs. And that is not unconnected to the history of the civil rights movement and the history of integration. So that when we hear people use the kind of neutral language of freedom, opposition to taxation, opposition to public goods like public transportation, et cetera, behind that often is a coded kind of language of racial backlash.
Oh, it's such an important point.
And I think people often don't see it. You know, so in other words, the people who say that can say, I think in good faith to themselves, like, oh, I'm not racist. You know, I have a black friend at work.
Have you read a favorite book around here is Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains. Have you read it?
I have, and in fact, she was a professor of mine in graduate school.
Okay, all right. So you come by it honestly, and so the two things that occur to me are one that where that book shook me was connecting when I had sort of thought of the Buchanan thing and the Hayek thing as uneasy allies. Right, sort of like the racist tradition and the market fundamentalist tradition, as well as just what you do to build a coalition that can win, and these aren't real buddies. That her case was no, this stuff was integrally intertwined in the ideological development of the United States of America going back to John C. Calhoun. That rocked me. And then the other one is, whether it's linked tradition or not, the other one is when I see, if I look at someone who's an avowed angry libertarian on their Twitter feed, too often times I look at their feed and I'm like, oh, that's somebody who, if they said they have a black friend, I'm not sure they'd be telling the truth, because I'm not sure you'd be able to get away with saying that stuff in my group of friends. And so maybe that's history. Maybe it's any last thought or a favorite recommendation of something to read?
White Flight by Kevin Cruz. And I'd also say, on the point that you just made, the distinction between conservative intellectuals and the conservative movement is really important, right? So we can read Hayek and von Mises and say that those people aren't writing out of a place of racial backlash.
Yeah.
But the movement that evolved around those ideas was very much about that.